There are voices that fill a room, and there are voices that fill something deeper, something closer to the hollow space people carry quietly inside themselves, without ever naming it. Neil Diamond had one of those voices. Warm, worn at the edges, unmistakably his. The kind of voice that made a stranger driving alone at midnight feel, somehow, less alone. Millions of people around the world knew exactly what his music felt like. Very few knew what it cost him to make it. This is not a story about chart positions or sold-out arenas, though there were plenty of both. This is the story of a man who spent decades translating the most private frequencies of human longing into something the whole world could sing. And what happened, one particular evening, when another legend looked him in the eye and asked, question no one else had dared to ask, the question that would quietly rearrange something inside him. Not a challenge, a mirror. Because the truth about Neil Diamond, the truth beneath the rhinestones, beneath the showmanship, beneath the enormous sound he built around himself, was something much quieter, much more fragile. And that truth begins not in a concert hall. It begins on a street in Brooklyn, New York, where a boy was learning what it meant to want something so badly it became the only thing he could hear. Neil Leslie Diamond was born on January the 24th, 1941, in Brooklyn, to a family of modest means and quiet endurance. The neighborhood was dense, alive, full of voices in other languages and radios playing through open windows in summer. A place where ambition had to compete with necessity, where dreams, if they existed at all, were kept small and practical as a matter of survival. Neil Diamond did not keep his small. From the beginning, there was something in him that reached. He was not the loudest boy in the room. He was paying attention, listening to things other people walked past without hearing, the rhythm of a conversation, the way a melody could change a person's face, the strange power of words arranged just so. He picked up a guitar in his early teens, after a summer camp experience cracked open something he had not known was there. He was 14. The instrument felt necessary, like finding the tool he had been unconsciously searching for all along. He began writing songs almost immediately, not because anyone suggested it, because writing songs was, for Neil Diamond, the closest thing to a direct conversation with everything he felt and could not otherwise say. There was a longing in him from the beginning, a reaching. The particulars shifted over the years, but the longing itself never left, and that longing, that unreachable quality, was precisely what would give his music its power. But the road from a Brooklyn bedroom to the stages of the world was not a smooth one. What the world would eventually celebrate, as talent arrived first, as something that looked very much like failure. By the time Neil Diamond arrived in New York's Tin Pan Alley, in the early 1960s, he was a young man with a guitar, a stack of handwritten songs, and a conviction so quiet it was easy to mistake for uncertainty. He had enrolled at NYU on a fencing scholarship. He eventually left college to pursue music full-time, a decision carrying the particular weight of choosing something no one around you fully believes in. Tin Pan Alley was a world of professionals and relentless economics. You wrote, you pitched, you were rejected, you wrote again. Diamond ground with it. He wrote songs for other artists, channeling his most personal emotional material into work that would carry other people's names. While there was craft satisfaction in that, something quietly accumulated, a sense of distance between the person doing the feeling and the person receiving the credit. He eventually began recording his own material, and the world slowly took notice. Solitary Man arrived in 1966 and announced something the music industry had not accounted for, a voice that did not fit neatly into any existing category. Too warm for folk, too earnest for rock, too personal for pure pop. It occupied its own frequency. And because it occupied its own frequency, It found an audience that had been waiting without knowing what it was waiting for. Sweet Caroline arrived in 1969 and grew into something nearly mythological. A stadium anthem, a cultural touchstone, simultaneously intimate and communal. Played at weddings, at sports events, in living rooms at 3 in the morning. The kind of song people felt they had always known, even the first time they heard it. The world was opening, but something else was happening too, something the applause could not reach. Fame arrived for Neil Diamond, not as a sudden rupture, but as a gradual accumulation, a slow filling of the world around him, with demands, with noise, with the particular pressure of becoming a public symbol. The longing does not dissolve when the record goes to #1. The distance you felt as a child does not close simply because thousands of people are singing your words back to you. Neil Diamond was a performer of commanding presence. He turned concerts into experiences that were warm and emotionally generous.
You bet,
Events
Elvis.
where people left feeling that something real had been exchanged. He had a gift for making enormous crowds feel seen. But the person who built that warmth on stage also spent considerable time alone, writing, who returned to silence after the shows, who carried, underneath the performance, a complexity the performance did not fully express. There are people who make art because it is the only way they know how to speak the truth about themselves. And yet, the same people often find that the more honestly they speak through their art, the more isolated they feel in ordinary life. Neil Diamond understood this paradox in ways he rarely articulated. Open in the music, quieter in person. And that containment had its costs. There were periods of self-doubt so profound they temporarily silenced him. Moments when the gap between what the music said and what his private life felt like grew wide enough to notice. And yet the music kept coming, because the music was not decoration. It was the structure that held everything else together. It was 1970, and Los Angeles smelled like possibility and exhaust in equal measure. Neil Diamond was 30 years old, carrying the particular weight of a man whose success had outpaced his own understanding of what he was doing. Somewhere inside that expansion, a question he had never fully answered kept surfacing, quiet and persistent, like a sound heard just beneath the music. He was at an industry gathering when Elvis Presley walked into the room. The effect of Elvis Presley's arrival anywhere in 1970 was difficult to overstate. He was not simply famous. He was something for which the word famous was almost inadequate. A figure who had altered the shape of American culture so fundamentally that it was impossible to imagine the landscape without him. He moved differently than others in the room. Not with arrogance, but with the ease of a man who had spent so long at the center of attention that the attention had become, in some deep way, irrelevant to him. He was present, genuinely curious about people rather than merely performing curiosity. He was also carrying his own considerable weight. The distance between the performer he had been born to be and the performer the industry required him to remain had carved something into him that sat just beneath the surface of the smile. When Elvis crossed the room toward Neil Diamond, those who noticed felt the charge of two significant gravitational fields approaching each other. Elvis extended his hand. Neil took it. And the conversation that followed, quiet, set apart from the noise of the room by the stillness both men seemed to generate, would stay with Neil Diamond for the rest of his life. They spoke carefully at first, feeling their way towards something. Elvis had an unusual way of listening, genuinely attentive, like actual interest rather than professional charm. He looked at you rather than at the room. At some point, Elvis asked Neil Diamond what he was working on. Diamond spoke thoughtfully, the way he did publicly, articulate, but with a certain professional remove. A framing that was accurate but curated. Elvis listened. Then he said something Neil Diamond had not been expecting. He told him he had always admired the songs, that there was something in them, a specific emotional quality, that reached people in a rare way. He named particular songs. He was specific, not general. And then, after a pause that felt entirely unhurried, he asked, when did Diamond write something, just for himself? The question landed differently than it might have, because Elvis did not ask it as a challenge. He asked it with recognition, as though he already knew something about the answer, not because he had been told, but because he had lived a version of the same question himself. When do you write something just for yourself? Neil Diamond did not answer immediately, because the honest answer, the one beneath the polished professional response, was complicated. The songs were always personal. They always began in something real and private. And yet, somewhere between the private origin and the finished product, something was also performed, shaped for reception, refined toward connection, rather than pure confession. Because what Elvis had named was a particular loneliness that belongs specifically to artists who give enormous amounts of themselves through their work, and discover the giving does not fully relieve the private ache that prompted it. You could write the most vulnerable song in the world, and the moment it became a hit, it also became something that belonged to everyone, leaving the person who wrote it standing at a slight remove from their own most intimate material. Elvis had lived this for 15 years already, and he was telling Neil Diamond, with the directness of a man who had no reason to be indirect, I see this in you. This is what I notice. What happened next was not dramatic. No one else in the room was watching. Two men stood in a room full of people, and one of them said something true to the other. That was all. But some conversations rearrange things at a level below the surface, in the structural places, where a person's relationship with themselves and their work is actually organized. And this was one of those conversations. Neil Diamond left that gathering, carrying something newly acknowledged. The question Elvis had asked had been present in his work for years, circling the edges of the songs without being directly addressed. The gap between the emotional truth of the material and the emotional truth of the life. Something in how he approached his writing shifted after that evening, not dramatically, but a deeper willingness to stay inside difficult emotional territory, a greater patience with ambiguity, a willingness to let a song carry something unresolved, not easy warmth, but something rawer and truer and more permanently alive. I Saeed arrived in 1971, different from almost everything that had come before. A song about displacement, about the failure of belonging, about the ache of existing in two worlds and being claimed by neither. Something that said, here is where I actually am, not where the success is, not where the applause is. Here, in this place of not quite belonging that has followed me across every achievement and will not be reasoned away. The song reached number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100, because the people who had been singing along with his warmth also recognized this. They, too, knew what it felt like to be in a room full of sound and still feel inexplicably far from everyone in it. That was the thing about Neil Diamond that could not be manufactured. He was not translating emotion into song. He was reporting from inside it, and the people who heard him could tell the difference, even when they could not say what they were recognizing. The years moved. Hot August night captured the electricity of a Neil Diamond concert, thousands discovering simultaneously that they were all carrying the same feeling, and this man on stage had somehow known. It became one of the best-selling live albums in music history. America, from the jazz singer in 1980, became a song about immigration and hope, played at naturalization ceremonies, an expression of what it meant to arrive somewhere new and reach for a life previously only imagined. He gave the world songs to gather around, even when he himself carried distance inside. In 2008, Neil Diamond released Home Before Dark, produced by Rick Rubin. Quiet, spare, honest in a way that felt different from the anthems. More interior, more willing to sit with difficulty, more direct about what time and experience leave behind. It reached #1 in the United States and #1 in the United Kingdom. Neil Diamond, at 67, had his first ever #1 album in both countries. Critics who had long since filed him under nostalgia found themselves writing with surprised reverence. Something in it refused to be dismissed. Something that said, "This has always been here. You just weren't listening for it in the right way." What Elvis had asked him all those years before, "When do you write something just for yourself?" found its most complete answer not in a single song, but in 6 decades of work that touched lives on every inhabited continent. Because the truth was that he had always been writing for himself. The songs had always begun in the private place, the unreachable interior, the longing that had been with him since Brooklyn. What he had learned over the decades was not to write more personally, but to allow what was personal to remain fully visible, rather than softening it toward comfort. The warmth in the music did not always mean life felt warm. But the warmth was real, built by a person who understood the cold, who had felt the distance and the silence and the particular ache of reaching across space toward something that could not quite be held, and had decided, over and over again for 50 years, to build something warm anyway. And if the man himself, in the silence that always came after, still carried something unreachable, still felt the distance that no amount of applause could quite close, then perhaps that was not the tragedy it might appear to be. Perhaps it was the source. Perhaps the longing that drove him to write was exactly the longing that made the writing matter. The gap between what he felt and what he could say, between the private ache and the public anthem, between the man alone in the room and the voice that filled the stadium. That was not a failure of connection. It was the very engine of it. He wrote because he was searching, and in the searching, he found the words that other people needed for their own. What the audience heard was beauty. What he carried, always, beneath it, was the need to give it. And that need, that irreducible, inexhaustible need, to reach across the distance and be heard. That was the most human thing about him. That was, in the end, the song beneath all the songs. The one he was always writing, the one he never quite finished, the one that kept him going.